My name is Fernando, and welcome to Exploring Traditions. Hello. Today we have Michael Sebastian Lux, also known as a Gentle Necromancer of Seattle, Washington. He studied psychology and social anthropology at St. Martin's University in Lacey, Washington. He is a member of several esoteric organizations in addition to being a priest at the Church of Light and Shadow. He has a strong passion for social justice issues and its intersection with theurgy as a path of personal and social liberation. It's a pleasure talking to you today, Michael. How's it going?
Pleasure talking to you.
So you have quite the background. Let's just jump right in.
All right.
What got you into the Church of Light and Shadow? Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, the Church of Light and Shadow existed for the work of the Morning Star in the world under both his guises as Christ and Lucifer. We're an independent and autonomous apostolic and sacramental body, but not dependent on the See of Rome. We seek to synthesize Christian mysticism, traditional witchcraft, Luciferianism, and offer the sacraments, sponsoring and facilitating group celebrations. And basically, we're a secret church beyond that.
A lot of people are brought up within a Christian household, Christian teachings. How does that balance out between that and to another extreme, I guess, what people find as like Luciferianism? That's quite the contrast in between the two practices and beliefs. I mean, there is an intersection there, but for a lot of people at home watching this, for them it's quite the stark contrast. How do you mediate between the two?
For me personally, and I'm not speaking on any dogmatic matter on behalf of the church, I think it kind of falls into kind of like a metaphor of thermodynamics. You have one part, the Christ, which incinerates us in love. Then you have the Lucifer aspect of the Morning Star that incinerates us and inspires us to knowledge. So for us, it's almost kind of a unique Western form of non-dualism. If you look at Spinoza, that's probably the closest you get philosophically to a non-dualism in Western philosophy. But for us, we kind of take it to the next level on a religious and epistemological level.
So even with a lot of the Christian practices, there's such a stigma against mysticism and magic, those type of esoteric teachings. How do you reconcile the Christian aspect of mysticism with that of other esoteric traditions? I mean, I've heard several cases where they say, well, Jesus himself was considered mystic in some instances. How does your own beliefs fit into this reconciliation between the two aspects?
I think for me, it's not so much a matter of reconciliation. It's more recognition. There are a number of really decent scholarly texts out there. Jesus the Magician is one of my favorites, where if we look at the context of Jesus in the time that he existed, purportedly, we see him at the crossroads of a very multicultural society where you have apocalyptic Jewish communities right next to very overtly magical communities such as the Greeks who were the colonizers, or the Roman Greeks who were the colonizers of that area, also the Chaldeans and so forth, as well as the Egyptians, obviously. So if we kind of put the milieu together, what we're seeing is it's very possible that Christ, or Jesus of Nazareth, I guess we should say, very likely was in touch with these communities and may himself have been a magician. One of the earliest artifacts that we have that directly mentions Jesus by name is this cup that says Jesus the sorcerer, or quite literally Jesus the Goetes. So, whether or not that artifact comes from a person who identified as Christian, we see a lot of parallels to like the magical papyri in that, where this person is calling upon the spirit of Jesus to act as kind of like an oracular intercessor.
People have described you describe yourself as the Gentle Necromancer. Can you elaborate a little bit on necromancy in itself?
Yes.
Quite curious.
Well, necromancy comes from the Greek nekromantia, basically divination by the dead, or through the dead. And it has a lot of different iterations throughout history. My primary background is in Kardika's Spiritism, which I kind of view as a passive form of necromancy in a way, despite what Kardec has to say about magicians. And that using that as a medium to kind of bridge the gaps in the missing living traditions of early modern magic, such as the Keys of Solomon and whatnot, it allows for a very free-form bricolage that is imminently accessible. So in my case, necromancy is, as it plays out, is almost kind of like a form of mediumship in a way, much like you would see with the traditional table tappings, or in Afro-Cuban traditions, espiritismo, working at the white table and so forth. So that's how necromancy plays out for me.
And I think you were mentioning to me earlier, you were a follower of the Book of Cyprian, or the Libro de San Cipriano.
Yes.
That touches a lot on these different aspects of different grimoires of the Book of Solomon. You have these different esoteric books that I guess they've been so far removed from our society that it's just recently it seems like a lot of people are digging up these older texts and manuscripts and using them to their benefit. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? It's quite interesting too.
All right. So I guess to clarify, while I definitely do work a lot with the Sorcerer's Treasure, the broader Cypriania is not a monolith. It's a constellation of related and sometimes even unrelated texts. So we start with the narrative of Cyprian, who was a famous sorcerer who did all of these really weird feats, and then eventually, after failing a magical operation to coerce a pious Christian woman into some kind of affair, he fails and himself converts to Christianity. And that kind of sets the stage, because you have this dialogue, or this dialectic of proud pagan sorcerer, but then he becomes Christian. Does he give up magic? Well, the texts often vary. I mean, if we look at the hagiographies of it, the mainstream would say, no, he just became Christian and became a bishop and was a martyr. But the magical literature takes a different spin, where it suggests that he just kind of lives on as this textual classic sorcerer in a way that even transcends the idea of Solomon, who is famous in grimoire literatures. So we have a number of disparate texts. We have the recension of Cyprian, his Confessio. Then we get to Iberia, both Spain and Portugal, where he takes on this almost like post-mortem folkloric reality. And then we end up with his literature in Scandinavia as well.
Oh, really?
Subsequently, it gets brought over to the New World, and that's kind of where we have Cyprian today.
Interesting. Yeah, because I'm quite familiar with how his teachings have basically been incorporated within like the Portuguese and a lot of the Spanish communities. It took on a life of its own at that point. But I had no idea it stretched out as far as Scandinavia. That's quite interesting.
Yeah, the Black Book tradition in Scandinavia is really, really fascinating. In fact, the Schwarzkunstböcker, as they're called, or the Black Books, or the Black Arts books, they're often frequently just called Cyprians. And a lot of them have bases in other disparate grimoires, like the Grand Dragon and so forth, as well as like bits and pieces from Solomonic literature, as well as folkloric practices that were dominant in Scandinavia and are in isolated areas still practiced.
And would that be considered left-hand or right-hand path in that regard?
I don't think that left-hand path or right-hand path are useful descriptors for it. It's more how they're applied. A really good example from, say, the Sorcerer's Treasure. You definitely have very coercive spells for romance, as well as, killing your enemies. Yet, if you start looking at some of the texts, you kind of see the types of people that were using this magic. These were not the highbrow literati. These were definitely the common people. A lot of these grimoires actually look like recipe books. There's a lot of spells for inducing abortions, which, that's a necessary thing if you're underprivileged and strapped for resources. You also have spells for, finding who stole your cattle, those types of things. So it's not highbrow magic. It's very much a lateral people's magic that's accessible. Sure, there are parts that definitely, harken back to some of the more high grimoires, but we can see textually those come at a much later date.
Even if, in some regard, like if you bring in the aspects of invocations and evocations, that's almost like a form of psychology.
Yeah, it can absolutely be seen as a form of psychology.
You're manifesting your lower self, or in some regard, into some physical form, and after which, within the boundaries, the proper boundaries, you could then control those lower aspects of oneself.
Well, right, yeah. One of my favorite admonitions in the Sorcerer's Treasure is before doing any kind of magical operation, you call upon the gnomes. And I find that really fascinating because whereas in the Keys of Solomon, you're doing extensive fasting and, calling on various names of God and the angels and celestial hierarchies. With this, we see very, quite literally down to earth, basically petitioning these terrestrial spirits that are almost subatomic, as they're described in the chapter on the gnomes, and petitioning them to open up the gates to heaven or hell.
It's like a form of these elemental beings are almost part of the natural landscape in which we could, it's not a matter of back and forth. It's an interplay of one's energy almost. You help them to some degree, and the reciprocation back is towards your own benefit as well. I remember in the Andes, there's several mentions of like these lower creatures, elementals, duendes as they call them. When you do these rituals, you push the energy, what you don't need, that substance from the ether, push it down into the earth, that then gets recycled into the earth and gets reincorporated into another being that might interpret that energy, that you're heavy, they call it heavy energy. They might interpret that heavy energy as their light energy, and it's just like this cyclical
exchange
movement of energy that just goes through and in turn, by you helping them, they will help take care of your crops, et cetera, et cetera. And I find that quite interesting.
Yeah, I find that quite fascinating as well because, well, you mentioned Los Duendes. They're almost kind of like an ubiquitous
Mm-hmm.
member of our shared cultural, spiritual landscape that I find very fascinating because I try not to be too universalist, just out of sheer sociological integrity.
Yes.
But, you know, it's one of those rare cases of every culture has a cognate to this. In the Rio Grande, it's kind of interesting because they kind of have a pop cultural depiction of the Duendes based on the Norwegian troll art that I find just absolutely adorable. But then, you know, you have different categories of these beings that are highly nuanced throughout Latin and South America and as far as the Philippines as well. To which degree Cyprianic literature influenced that or interplays, who knows? It's very common to use the Prayer of the Gnomes, like we find in Comte de Goblet, or the Cyprianic petition to the Gnomes, to basically start working with these people. And I do quite literally say people because it's very clear that they have finite existences while also being infinite and moving through us. In that chapter in Cyprian, they're described like atoms. They move through us. They feed off our emotions and work through our emotions to, you know, help crops or gain money or find treasure. Those types of things.
Yeah, I've heard several of those type of stories where if you're able to capture it, it could lead you to some abundance of source of material wealth and, you know, gold, treasure, et cetera, et cetera. One of the earliest depictions I've actually come across in reading a lot of the early literature of Spanish exploration into the Americas came from Cabeza de Vaca. He was actually shipwrecked off the coast of Florida. He made his way back posing as a shaman. And village to village, he would hear these incredible stories. And he later, when he made his trek all the way back to Mexico City, he wrote a big book on all these stories that he came across. And he was basically like one of the first proto-anthropologists.
Oh, yeah. No, I love his stuff. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, it's super fascinating. And people are still studying this because these traditions, these teachings that he wrote down, that he collected, are no longer. A lot of these tribes are no longer in existence, and so these teachings are pretty valuable. But one of the stories that really resonated with me was what he called la mala cosa, the evil thing.
Yes.
In one of the villages, I'm sure you've heard of this one. Yeah, in one of the villages, this short, stocky being with a beard, came in and was able to levitate their huts and just throw them up in the air.
Yep.
He ripped out the entrails of a person and threw them into the fire, and all the villagers, the indigenous people there in the village, all feared him. And Cabeza de Vaca basically made that as his a form of converting them to Christianity. Well, if you believe in the power of Christ, this thing will never come back. There's been several interpretations, modern interpretations, that it could have been perhaps Spaniards coming in. I mean, people don't want to really embrace the idea that this being was actually a real entity. And so, yeah, it's quite interesting. Do you have a take on that? I know, I'm sure you're familiar with that story.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely familiar with that story. I think that he's definitely touching on something that speaks to an experience that we've kind of lost in our modern world, in our industrial world, I should say, where the separation between spirit and matter we're not always so divided. Dreams are real, spirits are bodies. And if you look at, contemporary folklore, there's a really wonderful book, the New Mexico Book of the Dead, that touches on the interplay between, restless spirits and the duende, as well as indigenous skinwalkers and so forth. These are all very real realities and have real implications. The duende are frequently used as kind of a bogeyman in a lot of ways. However, that's not to say that they can't be coerced or bribed effectively to, coexist with us.
There's a lot of stories that I've heard where they're seen almost as evil entities, but in other cases, like in South America, particularly in the Amazon, when I was there was the entity of the Chuya Chucky. He has like a deer foot and a human foot,
Or a foot turned
and
backwards.
what he does exactly, and so what he was known for was to basically coerce people off of the main path. He would basically turn into like a bird or like a song or like almost like a siren, like something to basically get the person off the main trail, lead them deeper into the woods, into the jungle. At which case it would frighten them and their spirit would
Be ejected from their body.
go away, and it would become one again with nature. A lot of people would then pass away from the fright of this entity. But so it was always seen as a cautionary tale, like stay on the main path, don't stray from the path. But now, of what I've heard locals describing the Chuya Chucky, it's almost like it reversed its role. Now he's seen as like a savior. Now that there's a lot of illegal encroachment into the jungle, a lot of these illegal loggers and gold miners and
Farmers
drug smugglers.
Yeah.
And so he's basically the one frightening them to leaving their equipment and running away. And he's now turned from like this, almost like this demonic duende type of creature into like this heroic savior. And it's quite the contrast. And I find that really powerful in itself, that Mother Nature in itself has its
own autoimmune
like
basic defense.
Its guardians. Yeah. And I find that quite fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I find that fascinating as well. And it's kind of interesting too because, let's just look at gremlins. This classification of being didn't exist prior to the 20th century. It was kind of a bogeyman for Air Force people in the Second World War. But I think it kind of touches on a kind of subconscious realization that there is something that is not us that will definitely interfere with our own mortal and technological hubris. I stopped short of really comparing the duende to any meaningful level with the fairies, but you see that similar type of dynamic throughout time with these types of spirits. They can be helpful, or they can straight up ruin your day.
And for many practitioners of these, because I've read several books where there's different ways of summoning them, and I honestly was ever able to go that deep into it, but I've heard several cases where it kind of backfires, where they take over like a person's abode, their house, and they just cause absolute mischief.
Yes.
And in some cases, it was completely unwanted, and it was just some unconscious task that they did. They might have cut down a certain tree or something like that, and that caused this upheaval of the rage of the duende to lash out at them in their household. How does one go about even addressing the issue of the existence of the duende, and yet alone, how do you deal with something like that? That once it's in your house or in your life, how would you use that to your advantage? Assist, help it, and maybe learn from it.
In the Cyprian text, what I find very fascinating is the very, very clear impression that these beings, in the Cyprian text they're called gnomes, cannot be conventionally constrained or coerced, much like one would do with, say, a demon in the Ars Goetia, or summoned like an angel, because these beings are integral to Earth itself. Now, how to befriend them? There's a lot of different methods across cultures, ranging from actually one of the most popular spells in popular Mexican folk magic literally steals the text straight out of Charles Lallande's Aradia, of all books, summoning the Red Goblin into a stone to, bring you good luck. Other traditions also prevail where you can summon them by, leaving out offerings, or placate them by leaving out offerings. Traditionally, water is not one of those offerings. It goes back to a popular folktale about a duende who goes by various different names, but basically Red John, who tried to basically marry a human woman, and she told him, you can marry me if, and this is just one story, there's hundreds of variants, you can marry me if you can wash out all the black of my mourning robe. So he goes down to the water and can't wash out the black, falls in and gets carried away by the tide. And thus his thrall over the woman is broken. As far as antagonistic duende, again, it can vary from place to place. It's pretty clear that if you've pissed one off, frankly, you're going to have a lifelong enemy. And there are very, very few ways of getting rid of them that don't look like straight up exorcism.
Yeah, I've heard several of those cases where it's almost nearly impossible to even get rid of them once you get on their bad side.
Yeah, I was actually recently hired to take care of a haunting, and as soon as I got there, it turned out it was one of these beings. So,
and how did you resolve the situation?
I bribed it, and now I have it in my place, because sometimes it's useful to have gnarly beings that are a little bit wild to deal with particular matters.
And hopefully it's not causing that much trouble where you live now, right?
No, none at all. My cat sleeps soundly at night. The only duende that I have that really bothers her is my frontline duende.
Interesting. That's awesome. So let's change the pace a little bit. You've been described as the John Yarker of the 21st century, who has the audacity to learn all things. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yes. I was drawn to mysticism at a very young age, largely through very liberal and forgiving Catholic priests at my family's alma mater, which really opened my eyes to kind of a broader spiritual reality. Very intercultural, very critical, and, eventually you end up stumbling into magic at some point when you're in that kind of environment. So when I was 16, I was at a coffee shop that was right across the street from an occult bookstore, and happened upon a copy of Aleister Crowley's Book of the Law. Started reading more into that. There was, to my surprise, a local OTO body. I joined that, and that really kind of laid the foundations for much of my magical experiences. As far as Western esotericism goes, I got involved in critically analyzing the Grimoires, eventually became a Martinist, finally got ordained in an independent Catholic church. So here we are.
Nice. And I'm assuming you still practice a lot of these, like let's say like Gnostic traditions and even tarot. I'm sure you're quite familiar with tarot as well, right?
Oh, absolutely. No, I read tarot professionally 2 days a week at a local occult bookstore.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. And can I get your interpretation on the tarot in itself? Perhaps the origins and how it's used conventionally in a modern day society.
Well, tarot, to totally ruin everyone's day who have ideas that dates back to ancient Egypt, is largely a 15th century product. It was a playing card game of the elite because those are really fancy cards that need to be painted, and your average midwife is not going to be using them. As with everything human, we're meaning-making machines. So it was only a matter of time before tarot, playing cards, which also emerged at the same time, would start to be applied to some kind of oracular use. Now, fast forward to the 1800s. In the occult revival, an interest in the tarot emerged, trying to, either associate them with Roma or the ancient Egyptians, however you want to view it. It kind of became a weird departure from the fortune-telling aspect of tarot and into a more secret teaching, for lack of better terms, kind of a shorthand that as soon as you memorize the attributions, you're also internalizing a particular esoteric school of thought. In the United States, and, well, I should say in the English-speaking world, probably the best example is the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, with their attributions of the tarot to the various paths on the Tree of Life and so forth. That was not even an idea originally when tarot was being used as a fortune-telling device.
Really?
And there's kind of I like to create kind of like a false divide, and I acknowledge it's a false divide, between what we would consider in Western lodge-style esotericism as divination, and honestly straight-up fortune-telling. Probably the best example, because these systems came about at the same time, playing card divination, even with the varying interpretations of the attributions of the cards, it's almost a statistical diagnostic that borders on something like you would see a FBI agent using. Like, instead of the narrative that you get from tarot, that's kind of like a bedtime story, basically, because, if you're rich, you don't have to worry about the brass tacks of every day. You lay out a playing card set, and oh yeah, you're going to meet a dark-haired woman in the summer who is going to have money, and you're going to get married the subsequent year. Like, it's very, very literal, very, very linear. Not that you can't do that with tarot, because that was how it was historically done prior to the 1800s. But you kind of see that really sharp divide between basically the intersections of class and culture.
That's interesting. Yeah, because I'm quite familiar with the way in which other organizations, like you have BOTA and you have the Esoteric Order of the Golden Dawn, their interpretations of the tarot are quite different from, I guess, the origin of why they were created to begin with. And the use is completely different. I mean, you have different esoteric aspects and how one self-interprets those mystical symbols.
Right. And the first person to really kind of set that trend is Dr. Gerard Uncas when he was reorganizing the Martinist schools to kind of reflect a more Masonic type initiatory system.
Yep. 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 Yeah, he wrote that book, and
Yeah, the Terror of the
really good book
Bohemians.
on.
That's a
Yes.
classic.
That's it. I visited his grave in France, in Paris, France. Oh man.
Yeah. That was a memory
I was
I'll
fortunate.
always keep with me. One of my favorite texts written in the modern era on Tarot is Meditations on the Tarot, which is just absolutely amazing. And it really kind of goes into the intersections between the arcana and the hermeticism of the tarot, but also where that intersects with conventional Catholicism.
Really?
Yeah, actually, most editions now of the Meditations on Tarot, the modern ones, come with a foreword by the sometimes bad boy theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar, who's a Swiss theologian who was nominated to be a cardinal. And there's a really popular image, actually, of Pope John Paul II with the 2-volume German edition of Meditations of Tarot on his desk.
Oh, wow. I would never have thought. Never in a million years.
Yeah, I mean, and the really interesting thing is that, this author, some people claim to know who it is, but I still am not convinced. Either way, reconciles Hermetic thought, which has always been kind of part and parcel with Catholicism in a way since the Renaissance, and is not spooky or occult necessarily. But reconciling a postmodern Hermeticism, basically, with Catholicism via the tarot.
That's so awesome. And I'm assuming the symbols in themselves take on a more Catholic or Christian interpretation, correct?
It does, yeah.
How is
But it also definitely does touch on Hermetic Kabbalah as well, which is
interesting.
kind of a whole, mess. But that's a whole discussion in and of itself. The Hermetic Kabbalah, let's just go back in time. I'll lay it at the feet of Reuchlin, was kind of at the peak of Western humanism and reconciling Jewish mysticism with Christianity, unfortunately as a subversive means to convert Jews and prove through a Jewish-ish lens that, the Trinity is real and Jesus is actually the Messiah. But it's from that milieu that, again, we get back into the Hermetic mysteries as we would get with Western esotericism in the occult revival. But it also does kind of have a backflow as well, because we do know that the Kabbalah, and I'm saying that with a K Kabbalah as opposed to the Q Kabbalah, ultimately always exists at a crossroads of an almost transcultural Neoplatonism. While definitely Jewish Kabbalah is couched within Orthodox teachings, for the most part, Hermetic Kabbalah emerged almost as an unexpected anomaly that unfortunately many occult orders kind of treats as a Procrustean bed, but as a experiential exegetical model is very useful if applied correctly.
So the form of Kabbalah that you're referring to has to do with more with, because you have the way, like, let's say Pappus's interpretation of the Kabbalah, and that form of mysticism, would that be completely different from this original form, this lineage? Is it like, would it be considered like almost like a deviation from the original in the form of the way it's used?
I would say in the way that it's used, it would definitely be a deviation. It's on a shared continuum, because obviously the Christian, I wouldn't call them Hermeticists, but the Christian mystics who engaged with Jewish Kabbalah definitely found it meaningful. It's just that it's not the same thing. They're distant cousins, I guess we would say.
Okay. Well, I guess that about wraps up our time together. I just wanted to thank you again for jumping in on this call with me and running through a lot of these esoteric concepts, which a lot of people are. I'm assuming a lot of people are quite unfamiliar with, but would find very fascinating. And yeah, just wanted to thank you once again for jumping in with me.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for the opportunity.